So I think one of the most fascinating things about working in around ranches and around cattle is all the different type of people that you come across and all the many different types of perspectives that you come across, and everyone has a different way about doing things. And to me, some of them just make sense more, like low stress livestock handling and time you spend with your cattle and stuff. For instance, we tend to like to feed off a wagon, either hooked to a tractor or a pickup, and get off, cut the strings, hang out with the cattle, so that they're used to having us around. So that those little baby calves, when we're feeding them, they know that we're not a threat. And as opposed to jumping in a tractor, throwing the bale in the back, and then just feeding, and you can't hear them breathe, you can't hear so much stuff that goes on when you're feeding off the back of a wagon with just the low number of a pickup engine. So I've gotten to the point where that kind of relationship around cattle is very rewarding, and I see that when I see Bob's writing and when he talks about stuff. So he was one of the guys that I wanted to bring on to visit with really early, and I'll just turn it over to Bob and let him sort of give you a little bit about his background and what his goals are and what his mission is in life and where he's at and how he goes about doing what he does.
Well, I'm just an over the hill cowboy that never wanted to do anything but since being a little kid. Uh, but the low stress, or I'm not going to say low stress, the animal behavior has always interested me since I was a little kid. And I questioned why goats and sheep all graze together in their flock and the cows spread apart. And I was never satisfied with the answer, well, that's just the way cows are. And I played around with things. I mean, most of my career, I was fortunate enough to where I would uh, work a lot for absentee owners, where I might be on 60 section ranches and doing it by myself, so I could just do it however I wanted. Uh, there were times when people would question what I was doing, and in fact, they'd even get upset with me because I'm on 60 sections and I'm only burning 50 gallons of fuel in the pickup a month. And but my horses were all kind of looked like almost like starved out racehorses because I was putting some miles on them. 7 head of horses, and they looked like gutted snowbirds by the end of the season. Well, I was in the cattle. I was scouting for feed. At the same time, I was running my water lines. If I had a leak, yeah, I'd drop back to the house and I'd grab the truck and the plumbing supplies and go out and fix it. But in experimenting with the way I was handling cattle and that, I was clear back into the 80s. I would have cattle that were scattered out. You know how these desert ranches are. They want to scatter them out and they put them on drinkers where you might be able to fit 50, 80 head on a drinker, and then uh, I would be making my rounds and I would pick them up off of water uh, and it goes back to a lot of it. You don't know what you're doing it as you're doing it. I mean, we're all guilty of this. Uh, and since I started teaching, I've had to concentrate on it more. So I figured out more stuff. The more I teach, the more I figure out because my students will point out something to me. But I'd go into a place and I'd find feed in an area that after a rain and you've got all these little Tanahas or just kind of rock tanks that were holding water. And I'd call my boss up and tell him, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and move the cattle in that pasture up to there. And he goes, oh, people have tried that before. It doesn't work. And it might be 2 or 3 miles from water. And I would move them up there. They would stay. And I actually had to drive them out and spread them back out on their drinkers because they started going back 2 miles, 3 miles, and then traveling back up to that same place because it had better feed. So it's just been a, a kind of a long process. But when I first heard of Alan Savory, well, that makes sense except for the fences. And come to find out, uh, he didn't. start doing the fences, didn't even develop the deal with the fences until he came to North America. In Africa, they use herders. Well, it didn't make any sense to me that you had to have people sitting on them 24 hours a day either. But eventually I got to where I figured it out to where these cattle, if I had a big enough water source, I could put 1,000 head on there and have them to where they were staying together, leave water at the same time, come back. Ah, and it's part stockmanship and part of it is uh, synchronizing their water and rumination schedule. Because if you don't have that down, well, you get cows that they decide, okay, we're not going to go into water till 3 while everybody else is going in at 8, and then you got a group going in at 11 or 12 when everything else is going off. You've got groups going together, but you don't have the whole herd rebooted and in sync until that rumination cycle is in sync. But then again, if you also don't use the right stockmanship, it won't work. So it's interesting. I keep discovering more stuff about it. But on your feeding, what I noticed is when you go out there with that feed truck, all your cows come around that feed truck. You have the same cows at the front and the same cows at the back. And I started, once again, because I was, doing an absentee owner deal, I could experiment. And what I did is I would go out someplace in a pasture and I would put out feed without, these yearlings that they didn't know what a feed truck was to begin with anyway. So I would go out and I would put the feed out in 2 or 3 or even 4 equidistant lines apart. And I put out my feed, started out, first time I did it was with cake. And then I'd go ahead and I'd saddle up my horse and I'd go out and because all the cattle were staying in a group anyways, I would go ahead and I'd pick up the cows and the yearlings and I'd move them in. First time I did that, this place wound up, we're running King Ranch cows on part of the deal, and then with the heifers, it was King Ranch Santa Gertrudis heifers. And wintertime down here, you're lucky to get 3/4 of a pound a day gain, even feeding cake. Well, that year we wound up got 1.25 pounds. So we got a 1/2 pound more gain on those heifers than normal. And then we had the bulls on them for 60 days and wound up with an 84% conception rate. Well, that guy got cross. He found out what I was doing. He thought I was just wasting time. So there goes Bob. And Bob was kind of happy because, when I figure out something that works and somebody wants to argue with me, just forget it. I don't want to do it. So anyways, they went back and he was posting videos about showing how he got his impact. He would drag the heifers around with the feed truck and he'd put out the feed in a circle, and they wound up, they got a 3/4 pound day gain right back to normal, and they had their bulls in with those heifers for 120 days and wound up with a 45% conception rate. So there's obviously, and everybody that I've worked with that say, okay, why don't you try this? And if they're set up, if their cows are already broke to a cake truck or a feed wagon in the wintertime, they know what that diesel pickup is and they go to running. But if you get a bunch of yearlings or you get a bunch of fresh cattle in that don't know what's going on, it takes all that stress away. And it goes across the board. Everybody that's done it has gotten about, just right at, a little above or a little below a 1/2 pound a day gain more for putting an extra hour's work in. Well, today's cattle prices, figure out
Yeah,
1,000, 1,000 cows, you're getting 500 pounds a day. Even at 50 cents a pound, that's still 500 pounds a day at these prices now. At $3, you're looking at you get $1,000 on a half pound day gain. It really adds up.
So I had a question I want to ask you about your location, but I'm going to go off on a tangent here because one of the
Ooh,
breeds
rabbit hole.
is, yeah, one of the breeds that has always fascinated me, and I'm really fascinated by breeds that were developed here in the United States. And we ended up with some Santa Gertrudis one time, all the way up here in Oregon. My sister bought about 70 head of them, and they were originally brought to the West Coast by Howard Hughes because he was in with the folks at some of the people at the King Ranch, and they migrated all the way up to Washington State and were running in the coulees up there. And she ended up buying them and then bringing them back to the desert. And I always thought they were such a unique cow. And they have this really, they're really good mothers from what I've seen, but I don't know what you've seen. But I love their beller that they can call for those calves from so far away. So being from Texas, I was just wondering what your thoughts are on those breeds, those continental breeds, the Beefmaster, the Santa Gertrudis, the Santa Cruz.
It's interesting. How gentle were those cows?
I would say, well, we run Akiushis now, so I'd say they were medium. And they were not as
Okay.
bad as a Solaire, but they weren't as good as like a Hereford or an Angus.
Okay. Now you mentioned Solaire. Okay, if you go to France, Solaires are a dual purpose breed, and they run them into the barn and they milk them by hand. They come over here and they want to eat everybody's lunch. Now, this deal with the King Ranch deal that we were working on, people around here don't they know better than take in King Ranch cows. The guy that did this deal, he was thinking, oh, King Ranch cows, quality cattle, oh, all this. Well, these cows, when they come off the truck, they were hunting everything. They turned them out, and normally when the heifers came in, I worked for them for about 4 hours because they were hunting everything when they come off the truck. So I worked with them for about 4 hours, and then turned them out into a little trap with some feed, and I worked with them about an hour the next day, and then I just the day after that I moved them into a bigger trap with some feed. That was on Wednesday because it was a 3 day a week deal for this guy, and I went out on Wednesday and I moved these 285 head of Santa Gertrudis heifers like 5 miles up the mountain by myself, no problem. Well, they King Ranch switched the deal from straight heifers to they had a bunch of dry cow or a bunch of old smooth mouth, broken mouth cows that were going to have their last calf, and they sent those out. They were serious about trying to eat your lunch. And after I played with them for about a half an hour, they said, that's enough. We got other stuff we got to go do. So we turned them out into a little bit bigger trap. And didn't look at them the next day. They came in on Tuesday, didn't look at them Wednesday. So Monday comes around and they wanted me to just go move them down into that bigger trap. And I go out there. It's like, oh, this is going to be about a 20-minute deal. And I go trotting out there, and all of a sudden these cows start going down to one corner. And I thought, well, there was a gate up above where I could get around that fence in back of a hill where they couldn't see me. So I thought, I'm going to go down there and then just get them out of that corner before it breaks because the fence wasn't very good. Before I could get to my gate, there was just screeching wire. They started going up a mountain, and that turned into an 8 hour ordeal. Wound up having 3 other people horseback and a guy with a feed truck. And when we finally got them down into that trap, there were still 50 head up on the side of the hill. And I told the foreman, I said, well, let me switch horses and I'll go get those. And he says, if those witches are dumb enough they can't figure out how to get down, they can die there. He was hot. Well, I mean, it was like that. Just it gradually changed over the winter. But when they calved out, they were so. You got a 2 day old calf. They see somebody come on horseback. the cow would go one way and the calf would turn around and go in the opposite. I mean, it was wild. I've never seen anything like that. And some of them, they'd see if you're having problems with a horse. A guy working with me got an Okatia caught in his horse's tail, and he's trying to get that out. And this cow sees him from about 100 yards away, and she comes over there and dang near shoved him off the edge. It was good watching, fun to think about, but it's like he come awful close to going off a 75-foot cliff because that cow was after him. Ah, and we eventually got him over that, but they had also told us that the cows would play dead if they heard a helicopter coming because they always gather with helicopters and then get a big crew of cowboys to force them into the pens. And so we had these cows going on up this brushy draw, and they're going along pretty good. Well, they just happened to be doing a deer count, and those helicopters came flying in, going right straight over the top of us, headed up to refuel. And you would have thought they had a Gatling gun up there because those cows, they didn't just lay down. It was like they got shot, slammed themselves down, and just laid there.
Hmm.
And all we could do, we just looked at each other and just started laughing, because eventually we know they're going to get up. There's no sense getting excited about it. And after a couple of minutes, we couldn't hear the helicopter. And then, about 30 seconds after that, you see an ear twitch, and then another ear twitch. Then they just got up and started going on like there was nothing.
Hmm.
And then when we gathered them, we didn't, the King Ranch wanted to send up a crew, and we said, oh, we don't need it. And we had a third guy help us, and we brought those cows in and sorted them. I was riding a colt, and we sorted off the calves, shipped them off, and at the end, the guy told us, he said, I've never seen three people be able to handle that many King Ranch cows without a wreck. And if you would have told me you were doing it with just three people, he says, I would have brought a crew and we probably would have had a wreck. But he says, I've never seen King Ranch cows go out this quiet. And it all boils down to the stockmanship. So we talk about breed attitudes and how much of that attitude is within the breed and how much of it is just there's the potential there because they're sensitive, but we just bring it out.
Oh,
You look at
definitely.
it Santa Gertrudis, Celir, Limousine, uh, even Beefmasters. Beefmasters last year, that was one of the things he raced for is for being a docile cow. But you
Yep.
get on a lot of these ranches, and those Beefmasters are plumb crazy, and it's all in the way they're handled and the infrequency of when they're handled. Turn them out; those cows take care of themselves. Oh well, we need to brand, we need to wean, and then we get out there and yeehaw and oh how many you got to rope 4 or 5 to get them in and I mean every time you gather you have to rope something because they're getting away and nobody ever stops to think that well maybe it's what you're doing and if you mention it at all you're crazy you're just stupid you know
Oh yeah. Um. So I think that a lot of people that are listening to this podcast wouldn't really appreciate just how vast the place where you live is, like how much territory that you have to cover. And like we have big country up here, but probably not the size that you have up here. And just the
oh
pure um just
oh you've got a lot of open range BLM ground in Oregon, don't you?
oh yeah, we live in one of the most remote parts of the country
Yeah.
in the 48 lower
So say
48 state.
I mean, here, the biggest pasture you have is generally around 30, 40 sections. So it's still actually a pretty small country compared to Nevada and parts of Oregon and Washington.
Yeah. But I think it's hard for some people to picture that. You a lot of the times when you see stockmanship or low stress demonstrated, it's in a corral. When you do it sort of at a larger scale with four or 500 head of cattle or 200 head of cattle or even 150 head of cattle, it's a different
or
process.
3,000.
Yeah. And like, I don't know what your feeling is on dogs, but we use dogs and it makes a big difference on the big drives. I don't use them in the
If I was
trails.
younger, if I was younger and I had a regular job instead of doing what I'm doing, I would definitely get me a dog. And it's kind of funny because I've had dogs that I could take a bunch of cattle, take them to the pens. I could open up the gate, set my dog there, and all I had to do was hand signal to get out of the gate, tell her out, she'd get out, and then she'd go back sit in the gate. She wouldn't let anything come back in. And she was better than 90% of the people that you have helping watch a gate. But what because I'm a dummy, I never, I always teach myself everything, and uh, I would take a dog out and first get him at like 8 weeks old, set it up to where I'm the head dog, and then don't let them get anything for the first couple of months you're riding. Just have that dog sitting there with you, and they're going. Then when you let that dog start working, the dog works like you do. So I've never had problems like these dogs want to come up and just start driving on the back and pushing them too hard. My dogs always wind up working from the side, uh, and making an approach from the front. If a dog if it's facing the wrong way, I've had dogs that would approach their head and they cut across the back and the cow would go to chase them around, and then the dog would back off and the cow would take off in the right direction, which might sound odd, but if the dog is latched onto you and learning to work, the way you do, it's gonna mimic what you do. If you send it off on working as a predator, it's gonna work as a predator. Does that make
Oh yeah,
sense?
no, I see it all the time. The
And
other the other tendency I see from dogs is they want to bring him back to you. So wherever you're at, they're trying to bring that animal back to you.
yeah, and sometimes that works at a detriment. I've had a couple deals. When I was at Leachman's, Neil Braid used to send me off on things to to do by myself that should have been two or three people. And this one day we had like 300 or 400 cows that had got mixed in with the Indian cows, and he set me out there to take the Leachman cattle across the fence and leave the Indian cattle behind. And I mean, I was hot. I was hot. And he goes, "Oh well, you'll figure it out." And I got up and I started going, and it's like the Leachman cows kind of knew where they were going, and they were headed up there. So the Indian cows kept dropping back. Well, I'd kind of slip in there, cut them out, and drive them back. And it took 3 or 4 shots at that before my dog figured out that those were supposed to go the other way. And she started going. If they started following, she could chase them back the other way. So those dogs are versatile. They can think, and it's uh, it's amazing how good they can be even without a whole bunch of training. My last dog was a deaf dog, and there's nothing harder than handling a blind steer with a deaf dog. But she figured it out. So yeah, I like using dogs, but it's got to be in the right context. You don't need, these people think you have to have a dog with a lot of bite. You got to have, you got to have a head dog. You got to have a heel dog, and uh, got into a deal down here. A buddy of mine and I were out helping these people, and their cow boss had a pack of dogs, and they were causing so much trouble that the guy goes, "Well, I'd go to shooting dogs, but I just don't have enough ammunition." Really upset that guy, and he couldn't see. It goes back to how we observed. He couldn't see that what his dogs were doing were not helpful. It was there were getting after those calves. Well, they're getting after the calves. The cows are turning back on the dogs, and I mean, it was just a big ball and mass, uh, bovine all the way to the pens. So it's in a lot of this, it goes on how we observe what we've been exposed to, and when you really stop and look at, I feel blessed because I've been so many places. Uh, I mean, I've gone in when I was younger. I thought, whoa, I'd like to go into a place and just stay there for 20 or 30 years. Well, then the place sells, and or they change a manager, and boy, they just change out the whole crew. Or they're just I've never been able to take it when people are just really rammy and jammy, and I might go
Mhm.
on to a place and last 2 months when I was younger, and I just couldn't take the hammering on the cattle, and I just roll up my bedroll and I'd be gone. Yeah,
I was
but
gonna say,
it.
just listening to
Pardon?
you, you have been exposed to a lot of different cattle philosophies. Leachman has a
Ye-
really particular philosophy. Lassiter has a really particular philosophy. The King Ranch has really particular philosophy, and then you forged your own over the time. But um, my question was really going to be like the individuals that um influenced you over your path. But I guess your trajectory might
They've
have been a
been.
little bit
I mean,
different.
okay, I was forced that I mentioned Neil Braid. He forced me to go to a Bud Williams school, and the first time I ever heard of Bud Williams, I saw an ad and I thought, how stupid can you be? You're going to teach a bunch of people that handle cattle for a living, you're going to teach them what they're doing wrong. And Neil did a lot of things that I couldn't quite grasp. He was a good guy and he really tried, but he forced me to go to this school. And my biggest uh, epiphany from that was now I know why it's easier for me to work cattle by myself than with people. There were people there that were, the key to the gate. And I got tired of listening to them asking questions, so I finally raised my hand and Bud asked me, he says, yes, and I said, do you mean to tell me the guys on the back can sit there and roll a smoke or have a cup of coffee while the guy at the front's putting them in? And he goes, yes, and he changes the subject. And I, at the last day of the school, I normally don't eat lunch. I'd eaten lunch 2 days in a row, and I thought, well, I'm just going to sit here and talk to Bud. A lot of his stuff everything he said made sense, but I was doing some things that were different from that. And so I started asking him about this, and he goes, oh, yeah, all that stuff works really well. And I asked him, I said, do you have a school to where you can brush up on these? Because you didn't even mention them. He says, no, I don't mention them. He says, they're too advanced to teach. And that got me to thinking right there, well, nothing can be too advanced to teach. And it took me 20 years of thinking, and Neil Braid had fired me from Leachman's because of my sarcastic attitude. Uh, if I just kind of blurt things out when it's good comic opening, and I can't help myself, and and he didn't like that when I was doing it on the radio, and the whole crew could hear,
Yeah.
including the owners. So, but we stayed in contact for some reason, and he came up with a job opening down here, and I came down here to work with him on a was some irrigated. We had built it up to 12 pivots, plus we had uh, about 18 sections of desert, and he could see me putting those groups of steers together that were just running in a ball, and he wanted to learn, and I tried to show him, and he goes, that can't be it. It can't be that simple. And it is that simple, but that goes into how we observe things and how we um, how we decipher our observations. And the fact is 30 people can be right in the middle of something that happens. And if you write down, you take their statements right then and there, you've got 30 different answers. Now, if you take their statement again 24 hours later, you've got 30 more different answers. So you basically, between 30 people, you've got, let me turn this off. You've got 60 different descriptions of the same event from 30 people. So when you go to teaching, how many people are actually absorbing what's being taught without kind of making little tweaks in their own mind where they're not understanding it? And this is especially true when you're trying to teach it with videos and a chalkboard. And so I figured out what I need to do is when I teach a school, it is on cattle. My 2 day clinics. What I do is I do the stockmanship in the pens, but I try to get some of it each day outside of the pens, so you can see how what you're doing in the pens transfers outside of the pens. I had one of those last summer. The first day, they had a round corral, and I'd never done a clinic where they had a round corral, so I used the round corral, and the owner there, she does a lot of colt starting, and she goes, "Oh, this is just like round penning horses." And that's what people don't realize is that cattle and horses, any grazing animal, even chickens, have the same basic reactions to what you do and the same basic reactions to your body English, to bend in your horse's body. And she picked that up in the round crowd. Well, there was a guy there that's even older than me that he says, well, I kind of understand that, but he says, I don't see how it works outside. Well, we turned those cows out the next day or that night. They were in like one, two, they were in three different groups. So I said, well, we'll put these groups together, and, I'd take one person with me and somebody else was watching, and we'd move them, do different things. So it got to him, and they're kind of up in this little draw, and I said, okay, what do you want to do with these? Well, there's a box canyon that they'd cut a road out of in the middle, at the one end, and it had a little hill on there, and that hill is where everybody was at. And he goes, well, can we drive them around? Can we take them around that hill without them going up the road? And I go, yeah. And he goes, well, what are you going to do if they go up the road? I said, oh, don't worry about it. They'll come back. And he looked at me like he thought it was crazy. Well, we took them down there, and I got out the side, and I started hitting an angle. Some of them went up the road, but when I hit the angle, the bottom ones, the ones towards the middle and the back, started turning around. And then I started up that hill with my horse kind of bent into the cattle a little bit, and I didn't even get to them. They just turned around and came back down the hill. And that's when that's the point that he grasped it. But trying to get people to grasp the nuances of this, describing it, it sounds like you're in left field 2 ballparks over.
I got to interject here. This is something that's a pet peeve of mine, and I inherited it from my dad. And I am always fascinated by the hands that we see that will spend 98% of their day 100% focused on their horse, but yet they're a cowboy and they never really pick up the nuances of good stockmanship. And he's,
Well,
yeah.
even the horsemanship. What
Oh,
we
I think
tend to,
it's important.
what
I'm
we
not
tend,
displaying.
well, no, what we tend to do when we put a handle on a horse is we want them to circle, and we want them to do the lead changes, stop, roll back, and spin. That's all most people concentrate on. If you try going at a long trot and approaching cattle, and all of a sudden just bend your horse for that horse's two tracking through across the pasture in a trot and be able to, I can actually, in fact, I'm going to try to get some video of it this summer. uh, you can come up and back of cattle that are lined out, bend your horse into them just right, and you got to hit that sweet spot, and they will start turning around as you're approaching them to go the opposite direction. Which people think, oh, that sounds crazy. Well, it sounds crazy, but it works. It took me a while to figure out, hey, maybe I should try this, but it works. Well, at the same time, if you're going against the cattle, and and it's something that Bud had said, you go against cattle and they speed up. If you're going with the cattle, they slow down. Well, a lot is left out of that in the fact that if that was 100% true, when a couple of team ropers come out after a steer, it would stop and they would pass it up because they were slowing down. So you've got an area where you're kicking in the flight instinct. You got an area where it'll slow down, and then you have an area where they ignore you. So if you get in front of a bunch of cattle and you're going up them to strip them, if you're going, if you're just straight parallel to them, then you're going to get a response. But if you take your horse's head and you bend it in like that and you're going up, there is so much power to that because when we're doing this, we're not focused on the cattle. We're just focused on going by them. Or horse is just focused on going by them. But you get that little bit of a bend in your horse where your horse is looking at those cows and focused on those cows. I mean, it adds a lot of power. You get a lot more emotion. Well, then you start getting, and this is where a lot of people don't like doing this because they're afraid of blowing cattle out. You'll get some old rip out there, boy, she'll pick up her head and she'll start to run out. All you have to do is take your horse from being bent like this to straighten it out and ask it to just go the opposite direction a little bit. And that cow will immediately drop down. And when you get into the right position, get that bend back in your horse and she'll pick up and go.
This,
So you've
this
got a lot of different ways of handling a horse that most cowboys don't even think about.
That's 100%. And as you're speaking about this, when we had a conversation about this podcast, you were talking about bird vectors and mummification and
Murmur, murmurations.
murmurations. And it seems to me that if the horse is a better conduit to create those mummifications than us as a
Well,
human.
the horse is you can do it with your body. I had a guy call me up last summer, wanted me to go to Mississippi and work on foot, and it's like, I'm 70. I really don't like working on foot, but I thought, well, this is a challenge, and I've been told that I need to work with those type of people, so I did, and boy, we had a great week. We worked with actually four different groups of cows, because his was only 15 head, and you're going to just make them. They were dead to begin with, and we livened them up, but just turning your body one way or another has a lot. You can take the same path, but how you adjust your body, whether you're turned into them or whether you're turned away from them, will make a difference on what they do. And it was kind of funny because this guy really got into it. He's got a friend that's kind of into it and running around too much, really concentrated on it that much. But old Philip, he was sent me a video where he was doing live streaming a video, and then he goes, "Oh," he says, I gotta try this," and he turns the phone off. Well, when he had zoomed in, he had a yearling deer laying up pretty close to his fence, and he managed to get that deer going into his cow. He had like 15 cows, 15 sheep, something like that, and he had that deer going into his little flurd until his guard dog decided, oh no, that's not right. So I mean, it works on any type of animals that you want to use it on. I've moved elk through a gate on this circle ranch up here. We're moving heifers, and there was a bunch of elk up to the side. The heifers kept wanting to go to them, and I told the guy I was working with, I said, well, I'll just go put the elk in, through the gate before them. And he kind of laughed, and I did that. And those heifers, they just follow the elk right on through the fence.
Heifers, heifers are the most challenging
Oh, they're the
to start with.
easiest. They're
Oh,
the
no,
easiest.
see, when
They
I,
they're
my experience
yeah.
in Russia was we had heifers and no cows. So we had new territory, places they'd never been. They were in a foreign country, and we were trying to get them to learn the lay of the land. And I was completely blocked by a 13-inch iced over ditch because, and I didn't have my crew at the time didn't have much riding experience or cattle experience, but boy, those heifers, they can be obstinate and stubborn at times. But they're my favorite thing to work. But man,
Did
they
you?
could really throw a wrench in your
Oh,
plans.
well, for one thing, don't plan. I mean, handling cattle and is a lot like regenerative grazing because you got this set. You're going to take this route right here, but sometimes as you're monitoring that, you may decide it's going to be easier to go over here and around than in a straight line.
Oh, and we're
Is one
kidding
thing
experience,
because
Bob.
people do not. They just think we're going to go this way and we're going to do it by God, and then they have a big wreck. And heck, if they just move over 100 yards, everything could just go smooth. But the thing about heifers and yearlings in general, in fact, I love working with fresh weaned calves. They're looking for leadership. I mean, they're lost. They're looking for leadership. So if you have your stockmanship right, they look at you as the leader. And I mean, it doesn't take any time at all to be able to pick them up and go do whatever you want. I kind of laugh because I've had times where I've had 11 to 1500 head of steers or heifers, and when it comes time to ship, I can go out and I can just pick them up and bring them in, and it's no problem. And it's kind of funny how people accept that. They get amazed by it, but it's like down here when this place sold. Had a neighbor that he was going to call one day because the heifers were out, well, or the steers were out, and then he sees me come trotting up, and I looked over the fence, and they were going out the gate, and there was a little patch of grass there. They were sitting there, and I went back, and he started counting, and I had like 800 steers. And I come out the gate and I just wave at him and picked him up and I go to the pens. Well, I ran into him in Walmart a few days later and he looked at me and he started laughing and shaking his head. And he said he was, that's when he told me he was ready to go let somebody know that the cattle were out until he saw me and then he counted. He says, then he started going to the pens like you do it every day. And I said, well, it isn't every day, but just when I need to. And he goes, well, tell me this. How come you can do that with a bunch of steers and I've only got 250 cows and I can't get my cows gathered clean with 10 cowboys? And I told him, I said, well, maybe you need to get better cowboys. I mean, that's kind of the obvious deal. And when the place sold and I started doing day work, that guy refused to hire me for doing any day work, which that just kind of baffles the heck out of me. Why, when you see somebody over here that can handle large groups of cattle by himself, why don't you cut your labor costs and just hire him instead of using the 10 guys that you're using? But people don't think that way. If they don't understand it, they're not going to try it.
Yep. Well, that's like the guys that like the. I'm not a big fan of the fence line comparisons, but neighbors will live next to each other for 25 years, and one will have one set of management practices, and the other one will have another one, and one will obviously be better, and the other one will never make those. They'll never
Right.
adapt.
That just it's I see that. You go to Mexico, Fernando Falomir, all of his all of his uncles and cousins have all gone out of business because they're going backwards. Same with Alejandro Carrillo, and both of them were like on the parts of their ranch because it's an ongoing deal. They don't have their whole ranch completely regenerated, but the part that they do, they're running, you know, 3 times, 4 times more cattle than their cousins and neighbors ran, and yet, you know, ran when it wasn't a drought. They're running that many in a drought. You know, the the average down here is getting to be is pushing 200 acres to the animal unit, and they're running 35 acres to the cow on their regenerated parts. But their neighbors can't see that. They won't. It seems to me that that should be an obvious thing. That, oh man, look at what they're doing. I got to figure out how to do that. You know, that's kind of been my attitude throughout life. If somebody was doing something that looked beneficial and I didn't know how they were doing it, I was gonna start observing and asking questions. But for some reason, well, you know, my granddad didn't do it like that. And college doesn't say to do it that way, so it can't be right.
Yeah, Will Harris talks a lot about what he learned in college versus like how he runs White Oaks pastures now. And when you hear him talk about it, it's like nothing very little what he learned in college is what he actually is applying to White Oaks pastures now.
Well, it's interesting. I knew a guy that graduated from Texas A&M with a range management degree that he graduated in around between 2016 and 2018, and he had never heard of Richard Teague. Graduating from the school that the research was done in and had never heard of him. How does that work? I mean, are these college professors so so their egos are so hung up on what they've been teaching that even with something, you know, completely disavows what they've been teaching, they still can't admit to that being a possibility.
I was always fascinated in college. My parents went to the Savory Institute in the '80s, and so and they brought it and we applied it, but we made modifications that fit us. And but boy, when I was in 18, 19, 20, and hanging out in the ag room at the college there, I always took business, but I always hung out with the ag guys. You mentioned savory, and it was a bad word,
Oh yeah.
and now he's
Oh,
revered.
it still is. And
To some,
it's
in some
it's
circles.
you, you go it's really funny. Now I've worked directly with Roger Savory. I've never met Alan yet. But before I got involved with that Circle Ranch, uh, Alan Savory was over there for a tour, and they had state biologists and range management specialists, and they were out in this creosote flat, and they're talking about how the creosote sends out a chemical that kills all the grass, which that makes absolutely no sense at all because it's like the only place that you find grass in a creosote flat will be right next to the creosote. And there's some places, if you've got uh, a little bit of sand blowing up around it, you might have grass in there that's dense and you can't even hardly see the creosote because of the grass. So they're giving this spiel about, oh, you know, this sends out this chemical. And Alan, I guess Alan looked down and points at this deal and he goes, well, if that's true, how come there's so much grass right here around this creosote bush? And they just changed the subject. They can't even discuss it. You know, it's like this linear thinking. You just get these blinders on and you can't see. And it's, uh, I went to meet Temple Grandin when she was down at Midland here a few years ago because I discovered that she actually mentioned me in her livestock care book. So we got to talking about what I'm doing, and she just stops mid sentence and she looks at me and she goes, you know, you have ADHD and you're somewhere on the autistic spectrum. And I looked at her and I said, well, why do you say that? She goes, because if you didn't think like that, if you didn't have the ADHD dividing your attention around all these other things, you wouldn't see them. And if you didn't have weren't on that autistic spectrum, well, then you wouldn't be thinking about it. So it's they and I never did good in school. I was always kind of autodidactic learner where I could learn things on my own better than I could in school. But that's where, you're going to school and you're reading the book, and if you're going to get a good grade, you've got to know what's in the book, and you can't really question that because you're not going to get a good grade. Um, Fernando Falomir had a good example of that. He took uh, his classes was biochemistry, but he also took a range management class just to see what that was about. Well, it came time for a term paper, and he wrote one term paper, turned in identical term papers to both the range management and to the biochemistry. Biochemistry teacher said, "This is one of the best papers I've ever read." The range management teacher gave him a D, and he told him, he says, I'm giving you a passing grade because I can tell how much work you put into this, because he took it down to the molecular level. He says, it sounds really good on paper, but in practice it doesn't work. And so that's, where I don't know how much longer we're going to be fighting that, but
Only forever.
yeah, well, no, they're going to die. Eventually they'll die off. It's you got to make progress by attrition sometimes.
So I had a question. I wanted to, but the one thing I want to know is when you're doing your clinics and you got a group of people that you're working with, how do you know when they have that aha moment, when they click over and they start
When
to
they
get it?
when they click, it is obvious. I mean, the lights just go on. Ah, and I've got I've got a couple of clients in Kansas that Josh and Gwen Hoy. They've had me there for several times, and in fact, they're starting to help me business wise and going out and actually acting as instructors on schools so that I can get it through more, because it is hard to describe. And when one guy goes out and you're trying to teach 10 people, and the thing is all of this changes. You can't say I'm going to do this, because by the time you get halfway out there, that cow's positioned a little bit differently, and you have to do something else. So when I went to their place, his brother Greg told me, he says, well, he says, by the end of this, we're either going to tar you and feather you, or you're going to be Uncle Bob. I was Uncle Bob, but uh, last summer, Josh and Gwen met me in Nevada, and we got talking about it, and they're wanting me to cut down because trying to do 10 people for one person is just almost impossible, because I'll demonstrate what I'm doing a little bit, and then I'll start taking out one person at a time and talking them through it, have them follow me, and then I go through again. Where the more numbers of cattle that we have, the better it works, because everybody gets more time in with the cows. But I'll have a guy follow me, and I'll be, I can't really pay attention to what I'm doing because I'm turning around talking to them as I'm going, and everybody's up there like, well, what the hell is he doing? And usually by the end of a class, they're grasping it, and they're having. I've had people send me videos that they took, and you can hear the conversation in the background. They're saying, "Well, he should be doing this, and that guy should be doing that." They're they're grasping it. That was on Ricky Kremer's place, but they want me to go with no more than like 3 or 4 people in a class, unless I can have them or Ricky or Fernando or Pedro coming in and acting as an instructor, where they can describe to people what I'm doing as I'm doing it. and it makes it easier for them. We had one day there at Jorgensen's last year that uh, had 15 people in the class, and it was guys from and I've got whatever it is that makes it forget names, um, from one of those big ranches in Nevada, and they were looking, and they flat told me, they said, well, you know, we feel there's something beyond Bud Williams stuff, but your stuff just sounds so crazy that we decided we just need to see if it works. And every one of them goes, oh, this is cool, because they were really looking for something different, and they could see it. But if a person gets forced into it, they look at it,
Yeah.
and it's just you can't see it.
All right, we got to wrap up. Our hour's almost up,
Oh,
and
okay.
I have a couple questions that I really want to get to, but I just want you to take a little bit of time and focus on like this kind of stockmanship, this low stress philosophy. It has a real economic relevance.
Oh,
And can you speak to that a little bit? Because I'll just give an example for everybody. A couple weeks ago, Chris and I were out and we had a cow that lost her calf. And so we took the calf, put it in the horse trailer in the middle of the field, and then we did the work the cow around the trailer, work the cow around the trailer, and then she just jumped in. We were able to graft that cow onto a calf that had lost his mother 2 nights before, and we have a parental unit and calf now. And that alone, I had the loss, that was inevitable, but that alone saved me $2,500 because that cow's going to keep that calf alive. And that's just on a very small scale. But when you amplify low stress and the ability to handle your cattle in a
well,
low stress way, the economics of it is serious.
it's just like that little deal on feeding. Put out the feed and then take the cattle to the feed. That alone adds a half a pound a day to the gain on your fresh weaned calves and yearlings, plus increases your uh, conception rates. And then uh, as far as doing it in conjunction with your grazing, um, there's these people that reclaim mine tailings and old mines, and boy, they overfeed them and pack them in on that, and yeah, they get a big response. And you've got to balance that out. And what I'm trying to get some people to do, and I've got a guy really getting interested in it, is you're out in these pastures, and I mean, your pastures are at least 1,200 acres, if not, you know, 4 or 5 thousand acres. Before you even get your cattle in, you know, have your water set to where you've got one main water point, and go ahead and lay out your feed in several lines right there for 2 days worth of feed. Do that in 4 places. Well, when they're after the second day on the third morning, you go out there, you pick them up, and you move them over to the second one. Now your feed, you're not feeding as much, but you're feeding at a rate that you're going to get that same gain, because those guys were getting 3 pounds a day gain, but the cost of the hay was taking out the profit in the cow. So if they fed the, the amount of feed that they should have gotten instead of feeding so much excess, you're still getting the impact on the ground. You're still getting your uh, biological deposits in a way that uh, that's going to feed the soil, and you're going to get a big response out of it when it rains. And then a guy goes out there and moves it. And then on when you get over here to the part that's the furthest away, you go ahead and you feed, you know, you go ahead and make your move. It's only going to take you an hour or two. Well, then you've got time to go out there with the feed truck and lay out your feed in 3 or 4 different places where you've got another week's feed out ahead of them. I mean, when you compare that to having a crew build the fences and feeding too much hay, to one guy being able to do that whole thing, that's a big savings.
Yeah, labor
That's a
costs
big
one of the
savings.
biggest savings, one of the biggest places you can save on a ranch.
Yeah, and it's they say, well, and I've gotten into with people down here. They're saying, well, no, you can't feed cows and make a profit. You can't feed cows out on the range and make a profit. But for some reason, they think they can put them in the pens and feed them and make a profit, and then have to clean out the pens. It's like I kind of short circuit out on that. I cannot figure that out.
So I guess my final question is, what is your message to people, and what is your encouragement, or what do you want people to
Oh,
come away with
look,
from your philosophy
if
on
I'm
stuff?
70 years old and I'm able to do this at 70, it can't be that hard. It can't be that physically challenging. Okay, two is keep an open mind and keep looking for different nuances on it. I really feel that everything I've learned, I've just barely scratched the surface. And people need to keep an open mind. I do not want to be some guru or something. I want to be somebody's impetus to be able to go further than what I've gone with it. And I guess how to phrase this. Um, don't look at anything as being it's locked in. This has to be this, because you get locked into one box, and then you go, oh wow, I'm gonna learn this over here, and then you get locked into that box. And I like to think of my thought process as kind of like a crab pot or a lobster trap. You've got all sorts of water and silt and seaweed and maybe fish going through it, small fish going through it, but you catch the lobster. But you've got a lot of other things going through there that probably attribute to that lobster coming into the trap that you're not even thinking about. So just keep your mind open and keep looking at things, and don't get just locked onto one thing, because there's too many nuances, and it's too. If I'm still learning at my age, there's a lot more left for everybody to learn.
So give us a pitch on your clinics and how to get a hold of you. And
Okay,
yeah, how long? How much longer? You're in your 70s. How much longer are you going to keep teaching till you're in the
until
grave?
well, I used to say until I can't get on my horse anymore, but it's actually harder for me to get off the horse at the end of the day. Uh, it's been being cool down here, and they had a pump blowout, and I had to make some, you know, gather cattle. Well, I'm having to check water lines before I go move my cattle. So on a 12 section pasture, I got to make a couple of different jags at it, and I wasn't getting back to my truck till 8:30 at night, and uh, I just old age and stuff. I get on my horse in the morning the first time, and I get up on the fender of my trailer and go to, the horse comes up, I get on the horse, and off we go. I can't do that to get off because of the fact that the trailer is actually about 2 inches lower than the stirrup, and I can't get my leg up over, especially in the summertime when I got saddlebags on for my water. I kind of get hung up. So I got to have a mineral tub out there, set upside down, so I can get off onto that. So it's like when I get to where I can't step off onto that mineral tub without falling down, that's when I'll probably have to give it up, or get
And
somebody to
then
teach my horses to lay down so I can get on and off.
yeah, tell everybody a little bit about your clinics and how to get a hold of you.
Okay, uh, you get a hold of me uh, through my website at migratorygrazing.com, and the I've got a 2-day clinic which just introduces you to the stockmanship techniques, which we can do that in a pen or an arena. I prefer to do it someplace where we've got a set of pens. We can practice taking cattle through gates and through chutes and alleys. We can work both horseback on it foot a little bit, and then also be able to work the cattle out in a pasture. Um, and I'm getting ready. I'm changing the pricing on that, or I should say, Josh and Gwen are changing the pricing on all this for me. Uh, the the uh, the I don't know what prices they're going to set on the 2 day clinics, but the 5 day schools, and this is the one that is the most beneficial because if you're hosting that school, you go through the process. You know, everybody's going through the process of rebooting your your cattle. Well, the benefit of hosting it is your cattle are, if not completely rebooted, they are really close to being rebooted to where you'll be able to go ahead and just go out and go on with it without any time lapse of, okay, I got to drive home, got to make that 8 hour drive home, and I'm going to go do this with my cows. And then it's like to talk about that memory deal. It's what I did on that first day. You may kind of get a little bit confused on it. The people that have really glommed onto it, like the Hoys and Ricky Krimmers, or not Fernando Falomir, uh, Alejandro Carrillo's had a guy that grasped onto it, and his deal was, you could tell when his light came on because he'd heard goats as a kid, and he goes, "Oh, like goats," and boom, and he had it from that moment on.
Yeah.
And the pricing on the 5 day schools is $3,000 plus $1 a mile one way from either Van Horn or wherever the last school was at.
Okay. Well, Bob, I gotta tell you, I deeply I enjoy your perspective because it is fully unique, and you have a great knowledge on things beyond stockmanship and grazing, and so I'm really happy that you're out here passing some of that on, and I see you having a real positive impact, and I appreciate that. So
Well,
appreciate you jumping on the podcast and joining me for
I
an hour, and I
appreciate
think
you.
we might have to come back in a year and do a part two because I don't think we even scratched the surface.
Oh no, it can get really deep. It's pretty amazing. I mean, Fernando uses a lot of what I'm doing on his place, and there's just so many nuances between. I mean, just you look at 1 million pounds density per acre. Well, 1 million pounds density of herd impact can look totally different between a herd just grazing through like they graze through, or being forced to camp out for 2 or 3 hours. And then there's places where, uh, especially out in this desert, if you do 1 million pounds an acre and it doesn't rain for a year like it's been doing down here, well, all of that's taken away because you've loosened up the soil so much that it blows away. But if you can get 50,000 pounds an acre, and so that's 50 cows, and every time a cow changes, you're adding 200 indentations into the ground that collect water, and anytime that's right close to a plant, boom, you're making a big difference. So
Yep.
I mean, there's just so many nuances. It's just I'm gonna get cloned to my 22-year-old body and start all over,
All right.
knowing what I know now and
Yeah.
getting rid of the negative stuff.
All right. We're gonna leave it at that,
Okay.
and we'll plan on a part two.